Hi everyone, we're going to continue our series on playing the French defense as black. We've had two parts already on the Tarrasch variation, but there's one more setup that white can employ that black has to be ready for. So this is our third part in the Tarrasch. So let's take a look. E4, E6, D4, D5, the standard starting position of the French defense. Now knight to d2 introduces the Tarrasch variation. Now remember, white makes that move rather than knight to c3 in order to avoid the winnower variation of bishop to b4, pinning a knight on c3. So here bishop to b4 makes no sense. White simply plays c3 and we have to move the bishop. All right, there are a couple common moves in the Tarrasch, but the move we are recommending here is knight to f6 rather, immediately putting pressure on e4. Now white can defend e4 with bishop d3, or white can push the pawn forward with e5. That pawn push to e5 generally comes, if not now, then in a move or two anyway, so there are some transpositions possible. And when our knight gets attacked, it's going to fall back to d7. So now in this position, we've already looked at the move bishop to d3, in which case we started to pressure d4. We played c5, c3, knight c6, putting further pressure on d4. White has to defend it again. And we looked at both knight moves, knight to e2, and the universal system knight to f3 in our previous two videos. But in this video, we're going to look at an entirely different setup here, which involves the move f4, which can be played now or in a move or two. And so in this setup, white is being very aggressive and also creating this very solid center that's going to be hard to attack. White has ideas of not only maintaining his pawn on e5 by both of these pawns supporting it, but also white may push his pawn to f5 and attack us at some point. He'll have to prepare that move. He can't do it anytime soon without dropping a pawn. But he'll prepare this move f5. So what are we going to do in the meantime? Well, we're going to begin with the usual primary French defense pawn break, c5, and just attack part of the base of this pawn chain here on d4. Now, white will defend with the c-pawn, because if we take on d4, white wants to replace that with another pawn. Well, we'll put more pressure on d4. So these are typical moves we've seen in other variations, in other videos. And now that pawn on d4 is under attack twice. It's only defended by the c-pawn, so white has to defend it again. Now there's only one move that masters consider in this position as white. Can you guess what it is? How does white decide to defend d4? Well, at first the move looks a little unusual, but it's logical. The move is knight df3. So that actually triple defends it now by the pawn, the knight, and the queen has been released to protect it. So you may wonder why that particular knight rather than the other one? Well, a couple of reasons. One is this knight would rather go to the f3 square at some point in the future to get out of the way of the dark squared bishop. So this knight is blocking the d2 knight. Also, keeping the d2 knight here for any length of time blocks white's development. The dark square bishop can't get out. The queen is not defending d4. So white's pieces are a little more harmoniously developed when the d knight is put on f3. The g knight will get out on e2. First, of course, the light squared bishop will come out, most likely to d3, and then the knight will come in behind it on e2. So this is how white develops in this system. Okay, so now let's talk about two things in this position. As I said before, white may threaten to push this pawn to f5 and start attacking on the king side. So how are we going to stop that? And we are going to stop it. We're not just going to let it happen. So half of what you have to think about in this position is stopping that. And the typical way to do that is to push the pawn to g6 if necessary, so that you have this pawn duo here ready to stop white's pawn from coming into f5. So if necessary, keep that move in mind, g6. Also, very often this pawn on g4 or on g2 comes forward to g4 to help support this pawn push. Well, if it does come to g4, you almost automatically respond with h5. Attack that pawn so that the pawn cannot be pushed to f5 without dropping its support. So g4 is almost always met with f, or rather h5. Okay, so black often gets the pawns on h5 and g6 and creates this nice solid chain here on the light squares and controls f5. So that's what you're going to do on the king side. You're going to stop white's expansion over there on the king side. Meanwhile, your pawn chain here is pointing towards the queen side. You're going to have more space, more open space for your pieces on that side of the board. Both of your knights are currently on the queen side, on the right-hand side of this pawn chain here. So you're going to try to develop your pieces on the queen side and gain some space and get some play on that side of the board where you are stronger. So again, stop white's play on the king side, don't let f5 happen, and play on the queen side. So how do we play on the queen side? Well, we begin by exchanging pawns on d4. That opens up a little more space, and now our dark squared bishop can get into the game at any time. But now we're going to go for sort of a rare plan here. It's not the top move in the databases, but it makes sense. And in chess, you have to have ideas. You have to have concrete middle game plans. You have to know what you're doing in the position. And this move that I'm going to recommend here, a5, makes a lot of sense. Looks a little strange at first to be pushing a pawn on the side of the board, but you're playing on the queen side, remember, because you're stronger on that side of the board. And this a pawn is going to lead the charge. We're going to push it to a4 if allowed, and in some cases even to a3. And as it moves forward, it's going to gain us space and it's going to secure squares for our pieces. For example, if we get it to a4, then that partially helps us secure the c4 square, which we can occupy with this knight. Because if the pawn comes to b3 to try to chase us away, the pawn on a4 might be able to capture it. If we can get this pawn all the way to a3 and stop white's pawn on a2, then that a2 pawn can't come forward and bother us on b4, so we can put a piece on b4. So we're going to secure some squares for our pieces like this. And by the way, if we push the pawn to a4 and white stops us by pushing his pawn to a3, then he's just created a very weak square on b3, which we can occupy with a knight. That would make a great outpost for a knight. Particularly the c6 knight can go to a5 and then sink into b3. Okay, so the a pawn leads the charge. We've gained some space on the queen side by pushing that forward, and we're going to arrange our pieces over on that side of the board. So let's look at some typical play. What can happen from here? Well, white needs to get the king side pieces developed, and the method in which that is done has already been mentioned. Bishop d3. We'll push our pawn further to a4, and then knight e2. So that's typically where that knight goes. So white's ready to castle on the king side. Okay, I wanted to mention, besides knight e2, you may wonder, can white push this pawn to f5 now? I think he can. It's kind of complicated, but for some reason masters don't do that. Even though the bishop on d3 just supported that pawn push, So it would be safe to do so because if we take that pawn, white recaptures. But I think the mindset is it's too early to push that pawn because white doesn't have enough pieces developed yet. I think that's the main idea. So white typically prepares it a little bit more, gets the king side developed. White doesn't want to start opening any lines with his king in the center of the board. So I don't think there's anything to fear with that move, but if you are afraid of that move, then instead of pushing the a pawn now, you can actually push g6 and just stop that. As soon as the bishop comes out to support that pawn push to f5, you can stop it with g6 if you prefer. But I noticed most players play a4 here, and then knight e2. And now we're gonna lend a little more support to f5 at this point while we develop naturally. We're going to play knight to b6. So that's where that knight belongs anyway. It can sometimes come into the c4 square. Now that the pawn is on a4, remember c4 is a little more secure, okay, because the pawn push b3 is under control. But moving that knight to b6 also releases our light squared bishop. So that light squared bishop is now controlling f5 through the e6 pawn. So that does stop the f5 pawn push unless white wants to sack a pawn. All right, so now typically white would castle now that the king side has been developed. And we can continue with safety first here, and now is a good time where I think most people would push g6 just to stop that f pawn in its tracks. If white wants to get that f pawn in motion, he'll have to play g4. And do you remember what move I said you should play almost automatically when you see g4? Yeah, you should play h5 to try to undermine this pawn. So if the pawn now comes to f5, we just take on g4, and that pawn at f5 loses all of its support. Okay, we're going to be, after we take, we're going to be threatening that knight, notice. So if white wants to continue to expand on the king side and push for this plan of f5, then he's going to have to play h3 to support that g pawn. So now white is threatening to push the pawn forward to f5. He does have support to do that. I wanted to point out before we look at black's response to h3, I wanted to point out that once we pushed our pawn to h5 here in response to g4, it would be a terrible mistake, positional mistake for white to push past our pawn with g5. White doesn't want to do anything like this and lock up the king side and have no play on this side of the board. He'll never get in the pawn push to f5 now. We're going to have all the fun on the queen side while the king side remains locked. For example, if your opponent did do something silly like that, then you can push your pawn to a3, gain even more space, secure that b4 square so the pawn can't come to a3 to disturb a piece on b4. b3, knight b4, maybe white preserves his light squared bishop. We can play bishop d7, and we get easy development on the queen side. We're going to develop that bad French bishop out to b5. We're going to put the rook on the open c file. Queen can go to c7. So we get a lot of play on the queen side while that king side is locked up. Okay, so white doesn't want to push past our pawn. He can, however, try h3 in response to h5 to try to get in this move f5. Well, in that case, we'll exchange pawns on g4, and at least we have the open h file now for our rook. So that looks a little, that's a positional plus for black. So we've got that open h file now. Game could continue with bishop d7, putting that bishop on its natural square. Maybe a3, maybe knight a5, trying to look at that b3 square, and so forth. So these are just some of the ideas in this particular f4 variation of the Tarrasch. So I'm recommending making sure you stop that pawn push to f5 at all costs, and expand on the queen side and let that a pawn charge and lead the way. I'm going to actually look at the beginning of a Grandmaster game that features this opening. I don't know who the two players were or where this was played or when. I do know that black was played by Grandmaster Bunzmann, Bunzmann. So let's have a look at how this game went. It's a little bit different than the moves we just saw, but with the same ideas. So here's the Tarrasch. Knight f6 was played, e5, the knight drops back. And now instead of an f4 immediately, as we just looked at, white decided to push c3, black plays the natural c5, and then f4 was pushed. So we have a transposition back to what we were just looking at. Knight c6 pressures d4, and then white did play knight df3 rather than knight gf3, as we discussed. So black exchanges on d4 to gain some room for the queenside pieces, and then plays a5, our recommended line. Okay, white starts to develop their kingside, and here before pushing the pawn to a4, black did think that bishop to d3 is sufficient to ensure the push of the f-pawn here, so black decided to stop that now and address that rather than push the f-pawn. So black's being cautious and played knight b6, so the light squared bishop helps support that f5 square. Okay, knight e2, continuing to develop the kingside, bishop d7, castles, and now black pushes the pawn further to gain more space. Knight g3. So that's a different way to support the f pawn push. We looked at plans with the g4 and f5, but white can also play knight g3 to support that f5 push. Okay, I wanted to look at another line just to reiterate what I said before. If white decides to stop the black a pawn at a4, then a good way for black to proceed is knight to a5, looking at that outpost on b3. Then let's just make a move for white like king h1, knight b3, attacking the rook moves over. The other knight can come into c4 now, and those knights are really having fun over here on the queen side. Black's getting a lot of play on that side of the board. All right, but back to the game. So white did try knight g3 here, and g6 was played to stop that pawn push to f5. All right, bishop d2, developing the dark squared bishop. Knight b4, supported by black's dark squared bishop, attacking the light squared bishop. Okay, white moves it back to e2. Black pushes to a3, doesn't want his knight driven away with a3, so he pushes his own pawn to a3 to secure that knight. b3 was played, and now I'll show you just one more move in this game. Look at black's pieces. Black is really delaying the development of the dark square bishop, but it has many avenues, many places, possibilities. It's got some open diagonals. This bishop is the bad French bishop, and it needs to get out at some point. But also, at the moment, this knight is pretty bad. It's stopped by the pawn on b3 from coming forward, and it's blocked by its own pawn here in the center. So a really nice move here that Bunzmann made was knight to c8. Okay, retreating the knight, and the intention is to put it back into the game on a7, where it can support the bishop coming to b5. So black would love to trade off his bad light squared bishop for white's good light squared bishop. So you often have time to maneuver around like this when the position is closed, when the pawns are locked up. That's when you want to look for ways to reposition your pieces and I think knight to c8 was a great idea. All right, we'll stop the game there. That's it for this variation of the Tarrasch. We'll go ahead and look at other variations of the French in the next video in the series. Thanks for watching.